Chapter 23. My brother, Nayenezgani, the monster slayer, must slay the monster alone. He does not know this yet. Only I, his dead twin brother, can help him. He hopes to change the story of our ancestors, but he cannot do so. It is the way the story has been told. Our ancestors knew of the monster, knew of my brother. He cannot change the way of history any more than he can change the color of his skin. 2 miles ahead, the pitch-black ridgeline of the lava fields loomed above the desert floor. Centuries before, the area had been teeming with life. Successive volcanic eruptions had coated the entire region with a ragged, black landscape of hardened lava, covering roughly 200 square miles of northern New Mexico. The Spanish called the place El Mal País, the bad country. The Navajos had another name for it, Yeitzo Bedit Ninigiz. Literally translated, it meant, where big enemy god's blood clotted. Supposedly, in those black rocks, the twin of Nayenezgani distracted the monster while his brother took careful aim and pierced the giant's heart. The monster's blood flowed and eventually hardened into the black sea of rock. Or so it went with the Navajo myth. Nakai knew it well. His grandfather had brought him to this ridgeline for the first time when he was a small boy. They had stood in the twilight, and his grandfather had told him the myth. Nakai remembered the moment clearly. His grandfather was such an excellent storyteller that Nakai had thought he had seen the battle happening before him. Now his memory was tainted. Now, when he saw the giant of the myth, he saw the talons and armor of the monster he was currently pursuing. For the first time, he was truly starting to understand what his grandfather had been telling him. Nakai kept glancing up at the black ridgeline, looking for the creature, trying to catch a glimpse of the commando forces he knew were there in position. Of course he couldn't see them. If he could, they would be doing a very, very bad job. More than likely, the transport chopper had come in low from the north, escorted by the gunship, and dropped off the commandos under cover. Then, the gunship would have been hidden in a ravine, waiting to rise up from the black lava like death itself. But still, Nakai watched the ridgeline and kept moving. The last hour had gone quickly. The creature hadn't altered its course in the slightest, and from what Nakai could tell, it would be approaching those lava fields within the next few minutes, if it hadn't altered its pace. Now, the closer he got to that black ridge, the slower time moved. Nakai kept his silent march forward, tracking the creature. Tilden stayed behind him, also moving silently, 10 paces off to the right of his track and 30 paces back. Nakai felt comfort that the other man was there. He trusted Tilden. Tilden understood the desert. That counted for more than Nakai could say. The rest of the troop lumbered along, obviously tired. Somehow, the drivers of the 2 Humvees had managed to keep up. Considering some of the desert they had crossed in this last hour, that was an amazing feat of driving skill and luck. Now, the ridgeline was less than a half-mile ahead. The creature had either stopped or had slipped through the commandos, since no gunfire had broken the night. Nakai bet it had stopped. Nakai reached a rock ledge and halted, crouching, looking over the desert remaining between him and the edge of the lava flow. It was a shallow valley, with a dry stream bed running left to right. On his side was a natural rock outcropping, worn down almost to rubble by the winds and floods. On the opposite side of the shallow valley was the black edge of the lava flow. Somewhere in that shallow valley was the creature, Nakai was sure. But where and why it had stopped were other matters. Nakai motioned for those behind him to halt, then turned back to face the valley again. With a final thrust of crackling brush and engine sputtering and clicking, the noise died off, leaving only the normal sounds of the desert. A moment later, silently, Tilden slipped in beside him, crouching as Nakai was doing. Together they studied the area in front of them, watching for any movement, anything unusual at all. There was nothing. Not even the slight breeze brought Nakai the smell of the creature. Yet the tracks went on straight ahead, down over the edge of the valley, still unvarying, right into the bottom. Nakai glanced around and motioned for Major Lee to join them. Lee moved up quietly, kneeling beside Nakai. The Major was panting softly. The forced, high-speed march through the desert was obviously not something he was used to. "Do you have an infrared scope?" Nakai whispered. Major Lee nodded and opened a pouch on his side. He pulled out what looked to be a pair of binoculars, yet without lenses on the outside. Instead of looking through them, as Nakai had figured he would do, the Major handed them to Nakai, leaving his own night glasses in place. Nakai brought the scope to his eyes and quickly adjusted it. Then he followed the tracks of the creature ahead until he found what he was looking for. The creature was crouched on a ledge about halfway up the lava slope, straight across from them. The creature seemed to be looking back in their direction. Nakai scanned the lava ridge. He saw no evidence of the commandos. He handed the scope back to the Major. "It's straight ahead," he whispered. "Halfway up the slope." The Major flipped up his night goggles, then put the scope to his eyes. A moment later, he whispered, "Got him." Lee handed the scope back to Nakai, who slipped it to Tilden. "Stay put until I give the order," Lee said, slipping his night goggles back into place. He moved, quickly and quietly, back the way he had come. He had to report to the colonel. Nakai hoped the man would hurry. This was the second time he had seen the creature before it saw him, and the last time the only thing that had saved Nakai's life was the lucky appearance of that puma. Nakai wanted this creature dead, and soon. The longer they waited, the better the creature's chances got. "Any idea how we're going to get it off that lava?" Tilden whispered, staring through the scope at the creature. "We aren't," Nakai whispered back. "With luck, the commandos and the gunship will do it." Behind him, Nakai heard the movement of the men spreading out along the ridgeline, taking up positions facing the valley, and the creature on the far edge. They were too far away to open fire, so clearly the colonel intended for them all to storm the creature while the commandos and the chopper came in over the top of it. They were to be the diversion and the backup. The plan was risky, but it might work. Nakai hoped that none of the men around him got close enough to take a shot. If that happened, the plan had gone very, very wrong. The noise around them died down as Tilden handed Nakai back the scope. The creature, outlined by its heat and shape in the infrared, hadn't moved. It was just crouching there, black stone at its back. Clearly, it was waiting for the army to make the first move into an easily defended position. If nothing else, this creature knew the ways of war and fighting. Nakai would have picked a similar position if he had been pursued by a larger force. The problem was, the creature didn't know about the helicopter gunship waiting just out of sight and earshot. No position on that rock face was defensible against that kind of firepower from the air. The colonel and Major Lee joined Nakai and Tilden. "We're ready to go in," the colonel said. "See any problems?" "Yes," Nakai said. "That creature is defended and prepared. It knows about the ground troops. Just as we planned. But there's no way it could know about the gunship," Nakai said. "Let's just make sure it goes in first." "I was planning on it, Corporal," the colonel said. The colonel stood, forcing Lee, Nakai and Tilden to do the same. "Move out, people," he said, loud enough for all the men to hear up and down the line. "Make some noise, but not too much." Nakai moved left of the creature's trail. Tilden moved right as the rest of the men started down the shallow slope, kicking up rock and snapping brush and twigs. It sounded like a cattle stampede. He couldn't believe the amount of noise they were making, all seemingly without trying to do so. Then ahead, right over the position of the creature, there was a humming sound that grew deeper and deeper, as if the entire earth was shaking. Nakai had heard that sound a number of times. It was the gunship emerging from the ravine. "Goggles up!" the colonel shouted. An instant later, the night that had covered the valley became day, as the gunship lit up the side of the lava rock and a half-dozen white flares exploded in the sky, turning the darkness into a phosphorescent daylight. Nakai could see the creature clearly now, crouched against the rock, looking up at the gunship. He wondered how it felt at that moment, knowing it was going to die very shortly. Maybe that wasn't what it was thinking at all. Instantly, the gunship fired 4 rockets at the creature. Red streaks, like blood against the lit-up sky, shot from the helicopter and smashed into the creature's position, exploding with enough force for Nakai to feel it clear across the valley. "That ought to take care of the problem," Major Lee said. "I wouldn't be so sure, sir," Nakai said as they all kept moving forward. That creature had surprised him before. He had finally learned to take nothing about it for granted. As he spoke, from out of the exploding rock where the creature had been hidden, something shot upward, catching the gunship squarely in the center. The resulting explosion rocked Nakai and Tilden and sent Major Lee tumbling over backward in the desert dirt. Nakai covered his head quickly and ducked, waiting for the intense explosive light to clear, and any shrapnel. After a moment that seemed to last forever, he stood. And so did the creature, rearing up like a cornered bear, its back to the lava. The gunship was a falling pile of burning metal. Almost in slow motion, it crashed into the rocks on the valley floor just below the creature and exploded again, filling the air with smoke and yellow flame. The commandos were now on rocks all around the creature, firing at will. The creature staggered backward, again caught by surprise as it was hit over and over. Suddenly, the blue energy shot out from a weapon mounted on the creature's shoulder. The bolts looked like blue death, and they were aimed directly at the commandos. The beams exploded on contact. The power of that weapon was immense, easily slicing through commandos who were in the open. 5 of the commandos were cut down in the first moments of the fight. The rest dove for cover. Nakai shook his head. So much for the creature leaving its weapons in a camp. Obviously, this creature was far from unarmed. It just chose when to use a weapon and when not to, as any good soldier would do. "Return fire!" the colonel shouted. They were definitely in range now. Nakai and Tilden both dropped to cover behind the rocks, leveled their rifles on rocks, and began firing. Both of them chose to pull off single shots. Nakai figured the chance of hitting the creature at this range was much, much better with well-aimed fire. Clearly Tilden had thought the same. Most of the other men down the line opened up with full automatic fire. The sounds of the weapons echoed and doubled back, loud enough to do damage to any human ear. Nakai hoped that the noise bothered the creature, hoped that it struck some fear into the thing. The creature dove for cover, into the lava rocks, firing as it went. One of the Humvees exploded not far from Nakai, sending orange and red debris into the smoke-filled air. Beside it, a man screamed and rolled in the dirt, trying to put out the gas fire engulfing him. Nakai kept squeezing off shots through the smoke at the spot where the creature had hidden behind the rocks. Dozens of other men on both sides of the canyon were firing, some in bursts, others, like Nakai, firing one shot at a time. The creature leaped into view, firing rapidly with the blue-flamed weapon. A dozen explosions to Nakai's right shook the ground, as men died, some screaming in pain, some making no more than the thick, wet sound as their insides were blown out. The commandos on the rocks closer to the creature were taking even more of a beating. They were being picked off like ducks sitting on the shore of a pond. It seemed the creature never missed. But the remaining men were scoring hits. Nakai could tell every time a bullet pounded into the creature, making it jerk backwards. Its entire body couldn't be covered with armor. Some of those bullets had to be getting through, causing damage. Nakai and Tilden kept pulling off shots, consistently, both of them finding their mark. But since they were firing singly, and were at a distance, the creature focused its firepower on the closer commandos, and the men down the line who were firing in long bursts. 3 more shots of blue death shot out. 3 more men died. Then the monster started to move. With a quick bound, it was on top of the lava flow. Quickly, it fired a dozen more blasts, exploding rock and bodies with blue fire. The second Humvee exploded. 6 more commandos died. 3 more men in the valley were cut in half. Then the creature was gone, vanished over the ridge into the black lava field. The gunfire slowed and stopped. In the sky, small parachutes still held up the flares of white light, flooding the smoke and fire-filled valley with reality. Death was everywhere. Both Nakai and Tilden were slow to get up. They both kept their rifles aimed on the place where the creature had disappeared, just in case it wanted to come back and finish the job of killing them all. It had come close as it was. Finally, Tilden said, "Shit!" Nakai pushed himself to his feet and shouldered his rifle. The creature wasn't coming back. It had won this battle. It didn't need to return. Nakai looked around him. The flares slowly drifted down and went out, leaving only the fires from the wrecked gunship and the 2 burning Humvees to light the valley. Flickering yellow light that revealed broken weapons, and bodies, and blood. "Major!" Tilden said, moving to where Major Lee lay, face down. "Major!" Nakai stood over him as Tilden rolled Lee over. His face was gone, blown off when a burst of blue flame had caught the right cheek. Only smoking, stinking, cauterized brains filled the area where Lee's face had been. Tilden quickly stood and took a step back, forcing himself to breathe deeply. It was the image of nightmares. Nakai did the same, and together they stood there and surveyed the carnage. Of the 30-something soldiers and commandos who had gone into battle against one creature, fewer than 10 remained. Beside one Humvee, the colonel stood, shaking his head in complete disbelief. Nakai could almost read his thoughts. It should have been enough. If they had brought this much weaponry in for any human, no matter how well defended, the man would be dead. They had wounded this thing, but they hadn't destroyed it. Nakai suspected that they hadn't even come close. The colonel wasn't moving yet. He looked stunned. Nakai knew how he felt. One creature had defeated this many well-trained troops in conditions that favored the army, not the creature. "What the hell is this thing?" Tilden asked. "Adikashi," Nakai said. Tilden looked at him, his mouth open. "If that thing is Adikashi," Tilden said, "who is Nayenezgani?" Nakai stared at the ridge where the creature had disappeared, then said softly, "I am."